Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the Medical Center Hour. I'm Marcia Day-Childress from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities here at the School of Medicine. We bring you these programs weekly throughout most of the academic year. We have one more program next week, and then we end for the spring semester. Today's program, entitled When You're Strange, Stigma and the Struggle to End Homelessness in the United States, is our annual Kenneth R. Crispell Memorial History Lecture. This is offered in memory of Dr. Kenneth Crispell, a former Dean of Medicine and Vice President for Health Sciences here. It's also offered in partnership with historical collections in the Health Sciences Library, for whom this lecture rounds out this year's History of the Health Sciences lecture series. And I'd like to thank especially Joan Klein, my partner in crime, on producing some of these medical center hours, and also Susan Yowell, who through the year video records all of our programs. In medicine, as in life generally, history powerfully informs the present and the future. What we understand of the here and now is richer and sometimes becomes startlingly more intelligible when we know what's come before, when we have the backstory, when we have the historical context. For medicine, Siddhartha Mukherjee's recent book, The Emperor of All Maladies, offers what its author calls a biography, the life story of this disease and human efforts to cut it out, palliate it, and cure it. Knowing the history of cancer, we know better how and why we treat it as we do today, and how in future we might best apply knowledge and tools of genetically informed personalized medicine. For health more broadly, coming to terms with the historical roots and scientific and cultural traditions of some of our more tenacious social problems can be similarly helpful in illuminating prior intentions, both lofty and limited, identifying present challenges, and framing future plans. Last spring, our Crispell lecture with architect-photographer Christopher Payne looked at the complicated history, very much alive today, represented by the grand 19th century structures now abandoned and crumbling that were our nation's public mental asylums. What did we find in the plans for those buildings and in the edifices themselves and the ghostly effects of their longtime residents that might help us see our way clear to caring better for the mentally ill among us today and in the decades to come? So today we turn to yet another difficult social problem in the United States that has enormous implications for health and for health care: homelessness. In any community, homelessness is complicated by other factors: personal poverty, widening income gaps, unemployment, mental illness, substance abuse, all in one way or another socially stigmatized states in our nation. And homelessness today is exacerbated by the recent recession, by waves of immigration, and by the return in ever greater numbers of military veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. How do we understand and respond to homelessness? Decades ago, 30 years ago, in the years ahead. We're very pleased to welcome today, on my immediate right, Marian Moser Jones, Assistant Professor of Family Science at the University of Maryland School of Public Health. She will talk with us today about her research on homelessness in the United States, its recent history, its stigmatization, its challenges. We also welcome on my far right Colleen Keller, who is the Executive Director of PACEM, an acronym that means People and Congregations Engaged in Ministry. PACEM is based here in Charlottesville. It's a local nonprofit that helps to house our homeless population, and it's part of a larger community initiative to address and hopefully to dramatically reduce homelessness in the coming decades. Ms. Keller will offer a brief response following Professor Jones's remarks, and then we'll open our session for questions and discussion with all of you. You'll find short biographical sketches of both speakers in your handout, along with a really nice comprehensive list of a variety of resources on homelessness, its history, and sort of contemporary situations. So we welcome our Crispell lecturer, Marian Moser Jones.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Marcia. Thanks also to Joan Klein at the North Health Sciences Library, and to all of you for coming to listen to me today. So today I'm going to talk about stigma and the history of homelessness in the United States. The title of the talk, especially for those of you who are younger, is a reference to the 1967 song by The Doors, People Are Strange. It's about what life is like when you're a stranger, alone and unwanted, when no one remembers your name, as Jim Morrison sang. Now, I titled the talk this way, not just for nostalgia's sake, for the 60s, which I didn't really get to experience, but because I think it's important that when you're talking about people experiencing homelessness, that we try as much as we can to see things from the point of view of that person. How does it feel when you are the homeless person, when you are strange, out on the street, and nobody knows your name? And not to fall into the trap of regarding the homeless, as they are often called, as a group of unnamed others. Now, of course, we do this othering all the time. It's a convenient defense mechanism. When we see somebody, for example, you go into Washington, D.C., and you see somebody in desperate straits living out on the streets. And I'll argue today that a deep, historically embedded stigma toward the homeless plays a key role in enabling us to do just that. So what is stigma? Well, most well known in the social science world is the definition put forth by Irving Goffman in his 1963 essay. And he called stigma something that, it says, can't see it very well, but, well, a stranger is present before us. So it's something that happens when we see a stranger. And evidence can arise of his possessing an attribute that makes him different from us. And not just different, from different in the category of persons available for him to be, and of a less desirable kind. In the extreme, a person who's quite thoroughly bad, or dangerous, or weak. He's thus reduced in our minds from a whole and usual person to a tainted, discounted one. Now, this interpretation of stigma has often been narrowly applied as something that's inherently attached to an individual, that it's a disability, like a speech impediment, or that it's race, or that it's gender, or ethnicity, or sexual orientation, that these are all stigmatizing attributes. But if you really go back to Goffman's essay, he casts the concept not as an isolated attribute, but as a relationship between an attribute of a stranger, of another person, and a stereotype that we apply to that person. More recently, social scientists have built upon this idea of stigma as relational, as embedded within social relationships and power relationships. And I see stigma this way too. However, as a historian, I also, of course, want to historicize stigma, because power relationships, populations, stereotypes, and social conditions change. For example, in colonial Virginia, having a very strong right body odor was not a stigmatizing condition. Apparently, I wasn't there, but non-native people did not bathe regularly. But now if you went to colonial Williamsburg and you wanted to dress in authentic clothing and really be authentic so you didn't bathe for a week, you might find yourself the object of stigma, especially coming from the other tourists. Serious body odor is a stigmatizing attribute. And this is something that someone who's chronically homeless and doesn't have access to showers and bathing facilities faces regularly. So this illustrates that stigma is an historically evolving concept dependent on social norms and social conditions. And as I'll show today, the reasons that a person without a fixed place of residence might be stigmatized have changed over the years. So if we go back and look at the history of homelessness in the United States, we need to go back to the prehistory. And this is the period immediately following the Civil War. Now in these years, there were new railroad networks branching out across the West, and there was a population of restless veterans loosed upon the land. Now the growth of cities in the West, the growth of cities in the East, and the expansion of Western agriculture for the first time enabled a large population of unattached men without fixed places of residence to actually survive on the landscape. Now these men were most commonly known in popular culture as tramps or hobos, in the West, bindle stiffs. But you can't draw a straight line between today's homeless populations and the tramps of yesteryears. For one, these men were an integral part of labor markets, especially in the West, and in fruit farms, lumber camps, mining camps, factories. These factories relied on seasonal inflow and outflow of casual labor from transient men to function. Secondly, there was, for many, an element of choice in trampdom. We know this from the diaries and testimonies of tramps, that this subculture, with its collectivist, hard-drinking hobo jungle encampments on the road and its urban hobohemias, sometimes in Skid Row neighborhoods, offered an adventurous, responsibility-free alternative to the strictures of settled Victorian life. Now, this is not to say these men were not stigmatized. You look at this cartoon, this illustration. Now, even the cat is afraid of the tramp begging at the door. At the same time, there's a deep ambivalence expressed in this picture. The woman has opened her door, and while she's afraid, you sense that if she is not completely, she may give him something to eat, or she may not. But he's begging, he's not attacking. So there's this stigma and there's this fear of the tramp, and at the same time, a certain obligation on the part of the settled person to perhaps open their door. But during times of economic distress, such as the 1893 Depression, tramps and hobos were regarded as a dangerous class, a threat to a well-ordered society. And especially they were viewed as people who had an aversion to labor, who preferred to beg rather than to work. And they were seen to be responsible for their own situation. On the other hand, another group of people who were sleeping out in the open air during the late 19th century was viewed somewhat more sympathetically. Groups of children, most of whom actually did live with families in crowded tenements, worked and often slept in urban spaces such as this. Now, this famous photograph was reportedly staged, but these children may have taken naps, may have slept against the grate. Now, during this era, the end of the 19th century, people like Jacob Riis, who were calling attention to the condition of these children, did not blame them for their condition. In fact, these child-saving movements grew out of this concern. And there were some children who were sent to work out on farms in the West through these orphan trains. So there was this dichotomy between the street children who were seen as victims, not responsible for their plight, and the tramp who was seen as responsible for his condition. The worthy on one hand and the unworthy, the pitiable child, and the dangerous adult. Now, this split echoes an earlier division between the unworthy and the worthy poor in England. The English Poor Law, the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601, in fact made this distinction, and the worthy poor, widows and children, were accorded relief in the parish, whereas the unworthy poor, able-bodied men, were forced to work. And this classification reverberates even to this day with treatment of people who are homeless. It reverberated into the Great Depression, when there was a class of starving, unemployed veterans from World War I who marched on the Capitol to demand advance payment of a bonus And at first they were viewed somewhat sympathetically. They were veterans, which is the opposite of a stigmatizing condition. But when they encamped on the Anacostia and stayed, President Hoover and General MacArthur soon began to view them as a threat to the social order, a dangerous class like the tramps and hobos. And police crackdowns followed. Eventually the U.S. Army drove them out of their encampment. And even though Franklin Delano Roosevelt did provide some of these men work through the New Deal programs, even he refused to pass the law giving their bonus ahead of time. On the other hand, you had migrant laborers who were driven off their land through drought and poverty. And this group, a lot of women and children among them, garnered sympathy and pity from society as a whole. And this photo, Dorothea Lange's migrant mother, came to symbolize their plight. Now, interestingly, the situation of the woman in the photograph, her name was Florence Owens Thompson, is more complex than the photo lets on. The white light on her face and her arm and the towhead child obscure the fact that she was a Native American woman from Oklahoma who'd actually begun working as a migrant farm laborer long before the Depression, and she was not just a passive victim, but an active participant in organizing farm workers. Now, if you look at one of Lange's less viewed photos of this group, it enables the viewer to distance herself or himself from the woman, to see the bleak ugliness of poverty and its strangeness, rather than the humanity and sympathetic aspects. And so even within this relatively sympathetic portrayal of transience, as it was called during the Great Depression, there's a dichotomy between sort of almost a certain distance and perhaps disgust for the ugliness of poverty and appreciation for the humanity of people in this plight. Now, World War II transformed this picture. The GI Bill prevented millions more from falling into poverty. And during this era, only a small group of men remained out in the streets, the older men of the urban Skid Row districts. And these men represented the remnants of the hobohemias that tramps and hobos had frequented in earlier decades. And in the context of the spreading affluence around them, they were highly stigmatized, called bums. And many of these men, in fact, had chronic alcoholism. Many bounced from flaphouse to street to jail to hospital to institution. This cycle, however, also included seasonal and temporary periods of labor. Furthermore, unlike contemporary homeless populations, these men were not living out on the street. Despite this picture, these men are drunk out on the street, but they do not sleep out on the street in general. Why? Because vagrancy laws meant that anyone without visible means of support, and especially anyone who is publicly inebriated in this category, would be arrested for vagrancy. And police did this, made regular rounds. Secondly, there was a large supply of cheap housing, whether in missions or hotels in Skid Row areas, and so this prevented these men from being absolutely living on the street, even in the most bare way. During this period, stigma toward this group became embedded in urban geography, isolating these men within a few dilapidated urban neighborhoods within a suburbanizing nation. Stigma also became further embedded in the legal system through the systematic enforcement of vagrancy and public inebriation laws. At the same time, the medical system isolated another undesirable class of people from the shiny new affluent society, people with severe mental illness. Now, in the years following the war, mental hospitals reached peak occupancy levels. You may recognize this. This is the Virginia Lunatic Asylum, now known as Western State Hospital, just 45 minutes west of here in Stanton. And this hospital, founded in 1828, had long housed people classified in the 19th century as lunatics or later as mentally ill. And in the late 1940s, the hospital expanded and modernized, reaching a peak occupancy of 3,000 patients. Then came the community psychiatry movement that basically embraced the idea that there were new drugs and new treatments. And with these new drugs and new treatments, mentally ill people could be integrated in the community. And so by the early 1970s, this is from the website of the Western State Hospital, there was a move toward deinstitutionalization here in Virginia, and the population declined substantially and continued to decline. Now, the community psychiatry movement was not very well funded. There was a Community Mental Health Systems Act introduced by President Kennedy in 1963. However, this act was not very well supported. There were the mounting costs of the Vietnam War, and there was just not a lot of public sympathy for people with severe mental illness. And the idea that people could go live with their families was a flawed one. Here stigma entered in again. Many families did not want their severely mentally ill family members or could not afford to house them or care for them. Now, in my research, I interviewed Dr. John Talbot, a psychiatrist who began his career in New York City in community psychiatry in the 1960s. And he told me that by this time, patients from mental hospitals were being discharged without treatment plans or with treatment plans that were inadequate. They were being sent to single-room occupancy hotels, he told me. And this is a picture of one. They're basically throughout New York, some other cities, you'd have a single room with a bathroom at the end, maybe a common kitchen. He said they were sent to single-room occupancy hotels, and we were picking up the pieces. And these were not friendly places. They may have offered more freedom to the residents than mental hospitals did, but they did not offer a kind, supportive, or trusting environment. That said, even in the 1970s, hardly anybody was living out on the streets. In a 1976 book, a leading scholar of low-income housing in New York City could credibly assert that, quote, the housing industry trades on the knowledge that no Western country can politically afford to permit its citizens to sleep in the streets. What we think of today as homelessness was virtually unknown in this country. Now, some of you may remember this, but a lot of younger folks don't. If you go through and search through President Carter's public speeches, you can do this online now, you'll find references to the word homeless or homelessness only when he's talking about people in other countries, people displaced by natural disasters or conflict. Skid rows have been largely eliminated through urban renewal programs, and many of their residents, remnants of a cohort, a pre-war cohort, had largely died off. And since the federal housing law of 1949, Section 8 housing had been widely available to low-income people, and low-cost urban housing was available, if not desirable. There were a host of problems that plagued America's cities in the 1970s, but homelessness was not one of them, at least not until the late 1970s. Flash forward to 1979, just 3 years later, reports in the New York Times began to appear, such as this one, just casually mentioning a man who's, quote, sitting, disheveled and apparently disoriented on a bench on the traffic island at 91st Street and Broadway. In 1980, photographs from another New York Times article depict members of this emergent urban population living out on the streets while people casually walk by. And one thing that's shocking, and that is unlike other periods in U.S. history, is this new population included a considerable number of women. Now, shopping bag ladies was a popular term applied to this group. Now, at this time, two anthropology graduate students at Columbia University, Kim Hopper and Ellen Baxter, were hired by a nonprofit in New York City to do an ethnographic study of, quote, mentally disabled people living in the streets. They went out, they spent time with these people, they talked to them. They went with them to go get various services. And they published a report entitled Private Lives, Public Spaces. And when this report was released in March 1981, it made a major impact because Baxter and Hopper got the New York Times to cover it on its front page of the Sunday edition. The page one article, headlined "Help is Urged for 36,000 Homeless in City Streets," highlighted the quantitative estimate that these student researchers had made. The estimate, which Baxter and Hopper had cautioned in the report, was provisional, as it came from only two agencies, soon came under fire by New York City officials. This Times article and the report nevertheless created increased pressure on the city government to do something about this emergent problem. Now, in the report, Baxter and Hopper deliberately chose to use the label homeless to characterize the new street population. Now, they chose this word because it, quote, did not have a negative connotation like bum and vagrant, Baxter remembered in an interview with me. Now, this was not the first time social scientists used the term homeless to try to destigmatize a population. In the 1920s, urban sociologists in the Chicago School began to replace the term tramp and hobo with a new, more seemingly scientific and objective term, homeless. But in this earlier use, however, homeless had not applied principally to men who lacked any shelter at all. It was widely applied to single men who lived in the cheap lodging houses and primarily connoted the man's lack of attachment to a family group. 70 years later, Baxter and Hopper's revival of the term homeless reflected an equally ambitious, if different, agenda. First, they sought to destigmatize the population by encouraging the media and policy experts to forego derogatory terms such as vagrants. Secondly, in making, quote, homeless the primary descriptor for this new population, they framed the issue as a housing problem rather than primarily one of mental illness, personal choice, or individual social failure. Quote, we redefined it, Hopper explained in an interview with me. We said that mental illness is only part of what we're seeing and hearing from these other people working in the field. And so if we want to understand the particular problem of mental illness, we need to understand the larger issue of homelessness, within which this is just one small part. Their clever semantic move resulted in the widespread adoption of the term homeless to describe the population. And here's an example. If someone said to me, what's the single greatest problem in New York City today, I would say there's no question, the homeless, said the Office of Mental Health Director. Nevertheless, it did take the New York Times reporter several years to stop using the term vagrant altogether. Now, about this time, Baxter and Hopper got together with Robert Hayes, a young lawyer, to form the Coalition for the Homeless. In 1979, Hayes had brought suit against New York State on behalf of several homeless men, arguing that they had a right to shelter under the state constitution. The suit went up to New York's highest court, and in 1981 it resulted in a consent decree between the city and the state, in which New York City agreed to provide enough shelter beds to house all who asked for them. So here's some of the headlines. But this did not result in quality shelter. The city responded to this requirement by setting up massive warehouse-like shelters, like the Armory Shelter on 168th Street. Initially designed for 200 men, by the winter of 1983-84, it was housing up to 1,200. You can imagine this caused some problems. In an interview with me, Ellen Baxter remembered how different beds around the perimeter were classified using different colored lines to indicate the disease status of the occupant. Quote, there were yellow lines for people the staff knew had AIDS. There were red lines for people who were psychotic. And there were blue lines for the people whom the staff knew had TB. They kept the lights on all night long. So stigma became inscribed in the lines of tape on the shelter floor. At the time, some advocates for these people began to call this phenomenon TransInstitutionalization. Some people had gone from the state hospital to the SRO, flop house, hotel, to the streets, and now back into a new state institution where they didn't get any treatment. And interestingly, this system had been created partially in response to advocacy for homeless people. The people who argued that people who were homeless had a right to shelter. But what was happening was that as a result of traumatic experiences in shelters like the Armory, some people with mental illness or some combination of mental illness or substance abuse opted to sleep on the streets instead. They felt safer there. Now, this is not just a New York story. Down in Washington, other advocates were raising quite an alarm. Mitch Schneider and his radical left Catholic group, the Community for Creative Nonviolence, had erected an encampment across from the White House during the winter of 1981-82, which they called Reaganville. They hoped to call attention to what they saw as the effect of the new president's policies of cutbacks in domestic spending and deregulation on the poor. They claimed, according to their own surveys, that this was producing a population of 2 to 3 million people who are homeless. Now, however, the new administration insisted that homelessness was a local problem, centered in cities such as New York. And consistent with the Reagan administration's policy of devolution, which meant devolving control over funds for public programs to states and cities, most members of the administration did not see addressing homelessness as a federal responsibility. However, by 1984, Snyder, along with a growing group of other advocates and sympathetic journalists, succeeded in getting homelessness noticed as a national social issue. Homelessness made the cover of Newsweek. At the same time, the Democrats, gearing up for presidential campaign season against a very popular president, viewed homelessness as a rare issue on which the president was highly vulnerable. They held congressional hearings on homelessness, many at shelters around the country, and basically put the administration on trial for failing to do enough to respond to the crisis. When the Department of Housing and Urban Development released a report in August 1984 claiming there were fewer than 400,000 homeless people, not 2 to 3 million, as the CCNV claimed, this only added fuel to the fire as advocates and Democrats accused the administration of minimizing the problem to avoid doing anything about it. At the same time, there was an emerging group of researchers on homelessness, and there was widespread disagreement among these researchers on not only the scope, but the nature of the problem. Alan Bassick, who's a psychiatrist at Harvard University, said in a controversial 1984 piece that shelters had become open asylums. Others in Los Angeles reported 2 years later that the data supported a more complex picture of non-mentally ill, mentally ill, substance abusers, and non-substance abusers. Despite this disagreement, national consensus was building that something needed to be done on a national level to address the problem. In 1986, the president even agreed to participate in an event, some of you may remember, Hands Across America, where participants would all form a single chain of held hands across the continent and collect sponsorships to benefit people who were homeless and organizations. Protests in Washington calling for federal legislation on homelessness drew a diverse group of activists, including not only people from New York City, as is pictured here, but celebrities such as Cher and Martin Sheen. And this push, together with congressional support from Democrats, led to the passage, and some Republicans, led to the passage of the Stuart B. McKinney Homeless Assistance Act of 1987. And what this law did is really to begin to institutionalize the federal response to homelessness, not just by providing funds to shelters and states, but by funding demonstration programs in 9 cities to develop innovative ways to address homelessness, but also increasing research on homelessness and creating a federal body, the Interagency Council on Homelessness, to oversee all of these programs. Now, one of the major issues that still lay unresolved, as I think this picture hauntingly illustrates, was who are the homeless? And this issue did not get resolved for a while. People, in fact, still fight over what proportion of people experiencing homelessness are mentally ill, although 30% is come to be a common sort of estimate. What proportion experience substance abuse, what proportion are in families, etc. But eventually, out of the push to fund research, both by the federal government and by private institutions, a typology of homelessness emerged. In a 1998 journal article, Randall Kuhn and Dennis Colleen of the University of Pennsylvania proposed this typology. Now, Colleen was really a product of this push to do more research on homelessness that came out of the McKinney Act. He'd gone to graduate school during the late 1980s when homelessness held center stage in the media, and he'd done his dissertation on homelessness. And he decided, not coincidentally because there was both government and non-governmental support for homeless research, to continue with this subject. And so what his 1998 article proposed in lay terms was that there were different subpopulations of people experiencing homelessness. The transitionally homeless, people who were homeless from one night to a few months, who had one stay, who were often young, often became homeless due to a personal crisis, whether it was a natural disaster, a foreclosure in a home, domestic violence, or some other cause. And then there were the episodically homeless, people who shuttle in and out of homelessness, perhaps due to some of these same underlying causes, something like domestic violence, which is a cycle, substance abuse, which is a chronic problem. And then there was this small group, yet important group, the chronically homeless, who were, quote, entrenched in the shelter system, and often who lived out in the streets for many years, who were older and who'd had years of homelessness. Now, this also was accompanied by the big paradigm-smashing argument that the chronically homeless make up as little as 10% of the shelter population, but consume 50% of the resources. And this led to the argument, which really circumvented these issues over stigma and other issues, that it's actually cheaper, whether you care about people who are homeless or not, it's cheaper for local and state governments to house these people permanently and private organizations than to keep providing services to them. So another study by Colleen showed this very dramatically, that the cost of keeping a person on the street for 1 year included paramedic visits, $1,000 per visit, and you have many people doing many, many visits. Pickups by police, times being cared for in an emergency psychiatric facility, that this could all total up to $150,000 a year per person. And that actually providing permanent supportive housing costs a lot less. And that it could save money. And so this argument was very powerful for bottom-line minded city government and for other organizations. And this argument was taken up by Sam Sambaras, who's a New York City housing activist. He founded a group called Pathways to Housing. And this graphic from the organization's website really illustrates this argument well. You have their housing, which is permanent supportive housing, which costs the least amount, then shelter, then jail, which costs more, then the emergency room, which costs quite a bit, and the psychiatric hospital, which is, of course, the most expensive. Now, Sambaras added another dimension. He said, okay, permanent housing works the best, but most permanent housing for people who are homeless has requirements. You have to follow rules. You have to be sober. You have to be clean. You have to be taking your meds. How about we reverse this? How about we not have these requirements? Perhaps a requirement that you have a disability, but not a requirement that you abide by these rules, that you get sober first, that you get on your meds first. But provide housing first to people, support them with case management and with other services, and then maybe they will get sober and clean. Maybe they will start taking their meds, but they will be housed, and they will have fewer problems just because they are housed. Now, this was a very controversial move, and it still is. Many facilities still require sobriety and abstinence from substance abuse, compliance with certain rules as a condition of residence. Last week, I visited 5 facilities in the Tampa, Florida area, and 4 out of the 5 required all residents to maintain abstinence from drugs and alcohol, and the 5th had no alcohol on premises allowed. So there's still this stigma around alcohol and drug abuse in connection with being homeless. Just as with the tramp being assumed to be idle and drunk and begging when he could be working, the homeless person who is assumed to be someone who chooses to waste his or her life drinking or using drugs. Alternatively, there's an undercurrent that people who do not comply with sobriety rules are ungrateful, unorganized, or getting back to the older dichotomy, unworthy of assistance. At the same time, evidence has been mounting that permanent supportive housing helps reduce homelessness in the community. And the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, has pushed forward in the past 12 years 10-year plans in cities and states around the country to end homelessness. Charlottesville has one of these plans. Now this seems like an unattainable goal, maybe even a crazy goal, as homelessness has become a normalized part of the social and physical landscape, at least in many big cities. In LA, there are over 50,000 homeless people. But the federal government has even gone further than this in the last 2 years and pushed forward plans to prevent homelessness as well. The Homelessness Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Program, which was enacted as part of the stimulus, aimed at preventing people who lose their homes in the recession from becoming homeless. And anecdotal reports from many shelter providers at a recent conference indicates that it has actually been very successful in many cases, with as many as 90% of people who were assisted remaining housed over the longer term. Now, this program expired this year, and my initial research, just going to visit shelters in Tampa, for example, suggests that shelter providers are really struggling to make up for the funds lost. Currently, however, the focus has shifted to homeless veterans and ending homelessness among veterans by 2015. Now, the VA has just launched a $3.3 billion program to do so. So what's stopping us from really succeeding in ending homelessness? What's stopping the whole country from uniting behind this goal? Well, I hope nothing is stopping the country, but I think there are a variety of probable factors: apathy, cynicism, of course, concerns about the deficit. But again, there's this argument that ending homelessness is actually more cost-effective than continuing to allow it to occur. But I think one factor we have to look at is this continuing underlying stigma against people who are experiencing homelessness. And this stigma appears in the popular media, especially I've found it among younger generation of entertainers who don't remember a time before homelessness. For example, comedian Chelsea Handler, who was commenting on the alcohol relapse of a homeless voiceover prodigy, said, "You don't wake up one day and find yourself living under a freeway unless you've made some pretty bad decisions in life." Here she harks back to the stereotype of the tramp or the Skid Row bum who's responsible for his own sad plight. Another comedian, Daniel Tosh, recently joked that he has a charity called Febrezing the Homeless. "I spray Febreze on homeless people," he said. "Who would you rather give $1 to, a guy who smells like liquid garbage or ocean breeze?" Again, invoking the stigma associated with body odor. Now again, in addition to looking at television comedy, I've also begun to look at Twitter, which skews heavily toward the 18 to 29 age group, and interestingly is actually toward racial and ethnic diversity. And I found a variety of attitudes toward homelessness among this group. From aggression, wanting to punch a lame homeless dude, to generosity, gave a homeless guy $20, to judgment, homeless people wouldn't be half as poor if they didn't waste all their money on Sharpies and cardboard, to compassion, it's real windy outside tonight, poor homeless people must be getting it bad tonight. And then disgust, back to disgust, smells like some stanky body odor and a homeless guy's So, what are we to make of this? Well, it seems like in order to really end or reduce homelessness, it's necessary to educate the public on the true dimensions of homelessness, on who is homeless, and on the solutions that are actually available to reduce it. So with that, I will turn you over to discussing. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Marcia. She introduced me. I'm the executive director of Poncho, which I think a lot of you know about, but we are an emergency winter shelter here in town. And so we are part of a network which includes ourselves with about 65 beds, the Salvation Army has 58, the She Shelter, which is restricted for women fleeing from violence, and then a small number of beds at the Moore Center and for youth. So I would say that I think PACEM in particular relates back to the othering, sort of where you opened with. It rotates through churches every week. And I think one thing that has done, and I didn't appreciate it until I did this job, is it has helped keep homelessness within our community. Our shelters are not outside of town, and they are not in particularly rundown parts of town. They are right downtown, and that has held them within our community. We also have an extraordinarily vibrant soup kitchen network. And I think that those things have helped us have not maybe as much othering as other communities. And by and large, we have succeeded in what I would call relief. If you think of it in terms of sort of development, there's relief, rehabilitation, and then development. Relief would be food, shelter, and clothing. And I often hear people, particularly from the West and California, will come in and say, these people don't look homeless, which is sort of interesting. What does that mean? These people don't look homeless. But what it means is they're not emaciated, and they do have clean clothing. So from one perspective, I think this is something quite incredible about Charlottesville, and there's a lot to be said about holding it within your community. Our unsheltered rate, which is the number of, this is adults now, the number of adults in the community who are without shelter is 9%. So that number comes out of TJAC, which is the coalition, and we watch it every year because that is sort of what we exist to do, is to try and prevent that unsheltered rate. It is exceptionally low on a nationwide basis. So we would like it to be 0, but 9% in this economy has been a pretty big effort. The homeless count in our area, it was in January, it's 223 people. So someone said to me the other day, how can you work in this? And I didn't come out of social services, but 223 people, I mean, I actually know most of their names. So from the point of view of you being in Charlottesville and being in this community, it seems possible. I mean, 223 compared to 50,000 in LA, I mean, there are towns battling an entire population. We're really dealing with a very small number of people. Excuse me. Not mean to do that. We were speaking just before we started about this sort of nice coincidence of Marian coming here today. This morning, the first people moved into the Crossings, which is a supportive housing unit that is next to Reed Grocery Market and Brown's Cleaners on Preston Avenue. So 30 of those apartments go to chronically homeless individuals. 23 of those people are long-term PACEM guests. That means they have a documented disability and they've been homeless. We added it up, it was 120 years. Those people represented combined 120 years of homelessness. So this is a Housing First project. It is run by Virginia Supportive Housing. So it is run by someone with quite a track record statewide for doing this. For our community, it is the first time we really have that. It is for chronically homeless. So that 10% that drives 50% of the cost. So for us, it was some of the people that PACEM was founded to serve, and they've been with us a long time. Of the 23 that we sort of put forward, 20 have addiction problems and 11 have severe mental health. So it really, for those people, there weren't a lot of options. I mean, they were going to return to PACEM year after year. So I think it's going to be good for us all to see it. It is supportive housing. There are no requirements. So the idea is you stabilize your housing and the other things will come forward. You do pay rent. You do pay a nominal amount of rent. So for those people, it's an incredible opportunity. It may not be the strategy, and probably it's not for the 60% of people who stay at PACEM are not chronic. They don't fit the federal definition of chronic. So they are short-term. And the question is sort of what do you do to help them not become chronic and not return to us year after year? And that will have a lot to do with rapid rehousing. To put it in perspective, PACEM closes. PACEM exists to serve people who cannot access the Salvation Army or SHE. In terms of engagement, we do not screen. I think people know this. We do not screen for felony, for drug addiction. We don't screen for anything. We don't search and we don't identify you. We do take sex offenders. I think it's been incredible. We're one of the few left that does not even breathalyze, and I hope it doesn't change. We have found that we have almost never had any trouble. There is something about opening up your door and inviting people in that seems to cut off risk of different things. Quite frankly, our largest risks have to do with crowding and mental health challenges. The ability of people to sleep in a shelter with 45 men. For instance, if you were hearing voices before you came, you definitely hear them after you arrive. So I think that from that perspective, it's a very positive thing that we're not screening. The story of the tape really resonated with me, the color of tape. Let me see what else. I wanted to put it in perspective of you. With the 23 people moving to the crossings, we put one person in public housing with a Section 8 voucher this year. 240 people will have come through PACEM this winter. So when you think about what to do with this number of people, there's a real challenge with where do you go to and how do we support them in moving forward. And it's a question. We have a community plan, TJAC, if you haven't heard that. The plan is being reopened in about 2 weeks. And I think after being here, we should open some public comment into that plan. You all should know what it says. But I think that with just over 200 people, it should seem possible.
Thank you both. And we have a few minutes for some questions and comments from the audience. I think from both presentations, we also have an idea of what the healthcare and health challenges are. Not only for the community, but for the university and the community health systems here. But your questions and comments can kind of go anywhere. Who would like to start? And if you would please identify yourself. Thanks.
My name is Mike Bevins. I'm a physician from Texas and visiting here. I actually went to medical school in Galveston, Texas, where that Newsweek photo was taken. I can remember as a medical student, my first day on my internal medicine rotation, the chief resident's first name was Rob, and he had written on a whiteboard like that, the 10 rules of the House of Rob, which of course is a reference to the House of God. But one that I remember is homeless on admission equals homeless on discharge. So I wonder what you would say to him and to others who say that, you know, as health professionals and as a health system, patients' lack of housing is none of our business.
Marian cited some numbers that are just worth remembering. Mr. Colleen, when he looked at this, said they tracked 119 chronically homeless individuals in Boston. They used 18,000 emergency room visits in the course of 5 years. I mean, we just sort of can't afford to not try and stabilize them. To your question, and I know this may sound like pie in the sky, but what we see, I'm just going to read one, because I think if you're in the School of Medicine, maybe this will resonate. Someone came into us this weekend. She has on her person prescriptions for 20 milligrams, 40 milligrams, and 80 milligrams of OxyContin, Topamax, Vicodin, Trazodone, Zyrtec, Albuterol, Nasonex, Xanax, and Vimpat. So what we see is the difficulty of, you have to discharge them, but if they're using the emergency room to load up and then they're coming into a mass shelter, this is compounding. So to me, in a way, they are homeless. It helps for you to know they're homeless in the perspective of realizing they are going to a place where they will be non-compliant, unable to maintain their supply. and possibly distributing in some cases. We don't know, when people are discharged, we don't know that, and it sometimes takes us 48 hours to realize how volatile they are. And so this issue of programs communicating on a client basis and working together becomes very important. So I know it's only a partial answer, but I think actually it helps to know with what you outfit them with when they leave and knowing they're going to be back until we get them access to care.
My name is Michael Swanberg. I'm a nursing student. And that question leads me to ask the question, how many people actually come into the medical system with homes and leave homeless? I know that bankruptcy is very high due to medical costs, and I wonder how the medical system is complicit in this cycle of homelessness.
Well, I'll just say that, I mean, so I'm not a provider, but I've spoken to a number of providers, and it seems like with homelessness, you can't target one cause. So someone could have medical condition, not able to pay their bills because they've lost their job and they have these medical bills. And there's something going on in their family where someone else in their family is not able to step up and house them, you know. So I tell my students the family is the first human service provider. You know, it's historically, before any human service sector was invented, families and clans and tribes were the first one. And so you have to look at that always. And that's not to say that medical bankruptcy or medical and, you know, bankruptcy caused by medical bills isn't part of it. It's just one factor. You know, I don't see it as, you know, sort of the major factor, but certainly could be one factor in this.
And I would say I don't see it as a major factor. I think one thing you will see all of us doing, I mean, UVA supports financial screening and indigent care, and we have realized how critical it is that everyone that sees us is screened and uses that, because the more cost comes in, not in driving you to the shelter, but if you don't get health care at all for 3 or 4 years, other than that, those emergency rooms, you're declining so rapidly, and then you are a very expensive customer. So I actually don't think you're part of necessarily putting someone in a shelter, but then us not supporting them and seeking what's available, and there are things available, really multiplies is what becomes a significant financial problem.
Time for one more question.
My name is Richard Schneider. I'm a nurse. And I wonder if you ladies could comment on the urban myth, the anecdotal story that a lot of homeless people are homeless because they want to, because they can panhandle and make a lot of money that way. And just a personal story that I had, I remember I just recently moved from California. There was a homeless man. I stopped and talked with him, heard a little bit of the story, gave him some change. 6 months later, I'm in Lake Tahoe, California, and I'm walking through a casino, and I see the guy. And I didn't walk up and talk to him, but I mean, there could be 100 stories and reasons why he was now in the middle of the casino in Lake Tahoe. But I was just kind of taken aback, and then I saw him several more times standing on the same corner back in the hometown where I had given him money. So there's this urban myth that a lot of homeless people are actually cashing in on the generosity of people who will be kind towards them.
I can take that. So panhandlers and people who are homeless are not necessarily the same population. This guy may have had a place to live, you know, and for whatever reason made his income on panhandling. Many people who are homeless do not panhandle. In fact, I've even tried to interact with their chronically homeless people in Washington who I'll say, do you need anything? You know, when I go in to write it, and they say, no, I don't want anything. because they just don't trust anyone. There are homeless families who you don't see who are living in motels. Lastly, so I was just, again, in Tampa, Florida, which has a high rate of homelessness. They have a panhandling ordinance there, and they do in St. Petersburg, the neighboring city. Both ordinances have reduced panhandling to nothing, except on Sundays when it's allowed. And the people have to wear reflective vests as well. Very bizarre, but it hasn't had an effect on homelessness. So if you think about that, that shows that there's plenty of homelessness and panhandling. They're not at all synonymous. Doesn't mean that there aren't some people who do that and who are homeless. It's just that I think we have a popular stereotype because it's who we run into in the middle of the street is someone panhandling, and that person represents homelessness. Whereas as you were just saying, a lot of people who are homeless in Charlottesville, most people, you wouldn't know they were homeless.
We've come to the end of our hour, and I think this has been an illuminating session as well, and we wish good luck to PACEM and to the crossings here. I invite you to come back next week for our last Medical Center Hour of the spring. We have Jerry Medikoff from the Office of Human Research Protections, the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington, coming to talk about human participation in research, rethinking the common rules, some proposed changes in research practices. Please join me in thanking Marian Moser Jones and